You may notice I'm not Amber nor Chandrima. So my name is Steve Hewitt, and I am a historian, actually, who works on the history of terrorism at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. I teach about Air India as part of a year-long module, as they're called in Britain, that I teach. I regularly had, and he's been very kind to do so, have had Sushil come virtually and speak to my students. And it's my great honor today to chair and moderate this session. And I just want to thank Chandrima and Amber and Maya for this amazing event and that they put together. And it was obviously quite an incredible morning, and I'm sure the rest of the conference will be great as well. So as you may have heard, one of our speakers hasn't been able to make it. So we've got 3 speakers who are going to speak in the order that they are in the program. I'm going to hold them to 15 minutes each, which will allow time for Q&A, and then we have to be finished by 3:30 at the latest to allow us to relocate to a different building. So I'm just going to briefly introduce the speakers, and because there's longer bios in the program that you can all read at your leisure. So our first speaker, far end of the table, is Jessica Young, who's an assistant professor of English at Santa Clara University. And then next to Jessica is Maya Sesha, who is a critical race feminist scholar and PhD candidate at the University of Alberta. And then closest to me is Mira Nair, who works at the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology. So we'll start off with Jessica, and then Mira, and then Maya. I think that's the order, right? Great, take it away.
It's already on. Hello. I'm really grateful that I think it's kind of funny that I get to be the American that talks first. Sorry. But I just want to reiterate the thanks I have for the panel organizers and for everybody here in this room. I was here at the 30th anniversary, and I felt so fortunate and so grateful to listen to people's scholarship, their personal experiences, and learn about their creative works. And it's really shaped who I am as not just a researcher, but an educator. So I'm just so grateful to be part of this conversation yet again, 10 years later. So I looked at the panel title. I was originally thinking about talking about my research, and I started to really think about how Air India has shaped me specifically as an educator, because I started coming here as a graduate student, and it really has shaped my philosophy in the way that I see the world and see my role as an educator, especially to undergraduate students. And I think, to reiterate, I had some prepared notes. I throw them out in light of what has been said earlier today. And I sort of wanted to think about this division that got made in the opening panel and this before time with the struggle for recognition, and how my role sort of was as an educator in that moment versus what we seem to be in now, a different political moment now, both in the United States and obviously in Canada, with increasing polarization that has sort of visited Air India in different ways on different sides of the border. And I sort of wanted to think about how the American context is shaping how Air India can come and influence me as an educator now in the now times. So first, I wanted to talk about the before times, where Air India really helped me help students unleash what people have been talking about with this deep empathy that they've noticed from students when they come into knowledge, and not just from like a moment of ignorance, but to really understand that there is something that they didn't know anything about. And in Canada, I think that that's amplified, but if there is some sort of recognition, we were seeing with some of the statistics, some people know, but there seems to be a great lack of knowledge, especially amongst young people today, about Air India in Canada. That's just magnified in the United States. We've talked a little bit about some of the victims who were US residents or living in the United States, or possibly US citizens that were aboard the plane, but in the same way that it's sort of been evacuated from the Canadian consciousness, it's not even sort of recognized within the American consciousness in many different ways. And so I think students are really like, as they come into knowledge, feel a great sense of empathy that they didn't know anything about this. And in learning about it, really start to understand how the dynamics of what the Air India victims' family members experienced here in Canada also shapes their own understanding of their history in America, and how so often students, especially students of color, feel like their own histories are sort of evacuated from our founding mythologies, where we also sort of see ourselves as a nation of immigrants and predominantly white immigrants. And so teaching at a public liberal arts school, I feel like Air India helped students really form an understanding of history through a history that they maybe not necessarily implicated in, but still really greatly informed their own experiences of not seeing themselves and their histories in the curriculums that we teach. And to see that sort of mirrored in Canada, which we are sort of programmed in America to sort of believe is a little bit more progressive in its multicultural politics, makes them sort of understand that, like, this happens everywhere. It doesn't just happen in America, it happens everywhere. And it gets them to start looking at how we shape history, how the nation and how the state really curtails or shapes histories in certain ways, privileging certain narratives while suppressing others. So usually it's not all roses when I teach Air India in America. I have a couple challenges. One is that it's really hard to get a hold of materials, and I've been greatly indebted to the organizers of this conference for getting scholarship out there that can be accessed in America, for publishing things like Remembering Air India, that archives some of the primary source documents, the redacted testimony that was in the official inquiry, or that was left out of the official inquiry but was produced for the official inquiry. Things that students can now get a hold of in America, in which to sort of pursue their own research, pursue actually in action how Air India and the memories of Air India is shaped and constrained by the state. And that is really informative for them. Originally when I was teaching, I think one of the only texts I could really teach was The Management of Grief, which is, I think, a really, really great short story. I'm sure most people in this room have read it. But it doesn't actually say at any point that it is based on a historical event. And indeed, I was really shocked when I was a graduate student talking about how I taught Air India, and my friend was like, oh, I teach that short story all the time. What is this Air India thing that you're talking about? I'm like, how do you teach this short story and not know the history that it's based off of? And so I felt like a lot of my work was about taking up this mantle that I hear people calling for today, to teach this history, to make sure that students understand it, even on my side of the border, that people understand it. I think that that's incredibly important. But to also sort of think about the challenges in making that history apparent to people in America, where we don't have a lot of the creative texts, the novels don't always circulate or migrate to the United States. I have to specially order them. So there are some challenges in teaching this history. I did want to share a successful moment where I felt like Air India really unlocked something for a student. I taught Air India in a world literature class, and then a student was sort of so inspired and had this really deep empathetic attachment to the history I was sort of laying out, and wanted to learn more after we read The Management of Grief. So we created an independent study project, and even though we couldn't get a lot of the text in a short amount of time that we had together, they read Shireen Razak's report. They read Children of Air India and some other selections from Remembering Air India, and came up with a really amazing sort of reflection on how one can build empathy through creative works. And this went and led to their senior thesis project, where they created their own work about the Haitian Revolution. They were a Haitian American student. And about thinking about how their history had been shaped and curtailed by colonialism and colonial narratives, about how America sort of fashioned its own identity that sort of divorced our revolutionary history from the Haitian Revolution, and really sort of attributed a lot of that research methodology and how they viewed their own history through what they learned about Air India when we did our final exam, when we were doing the committee examination of the senior thesis. So that was really heartening, that I felt like a student who had no real relationship to Air India felt so deeply empathetic about what they had learned that that translated into their own methodological understanding of how to approach their own history. So if I can bring anything back from America, from the before times, I hope it is that. And now I sort of wanted to talk about the now times. When I applied to this conference, we were living in a very different political moment than we are now. It all changed for me, not in January 20th of this year, but actually January 6, 2023. I was not at Santa Clara University at that time. I was at New College of Florida. I don't know if anyone's heard of it, but at that date, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis appointed 6 new trustee members to our board, creating a very conservative majority. These included members of conservative think tanks, President Trump's 1776 Commission, and most notably, the activist Christopher Rufo, who was known for turning critical race theory into an incendiary dog whistle, the backlash against diversity, equity, inclusion, also known as DEI in the United States, and teaching histories of colonialism, colonization, settler colonialism, racism, against the backdrop of a trustee who said that they're going to hire people in conservative-friendly disciplines such as constitutionalism, free enterprise, and American principles, and that DEI programming will be replaced with an equality, merit, and colorblindness department, really is chilling. How do you teach Air India or other histories that are implicated in that tragedy or like that tragedy when you have a trustee basically saying, do not see race? There is no such thing as racism. The veneer of multiculturalism has completely slipped away. And so, obviously I was very afraid of losing my job. As we've known since January, a lot of American academics have talked about preemptive censorship, of censoring their thoughts, censoring their syllabi, censoring their curriculum, in order to not face backlash from the public, from politicians, from colleagues, from students. And for 2 years, I was really afraid about getting outed and doxxed by my own trustees, my students, my newly hired colleagues. And when faced with all that pressure, what did I do? Well, I decided I wasn't going to censor myself at all. I decided that I was going to take a political stance and teach the histories despite how scared I was to do it. And that sort of caused me to embrace a certain form of precarity, knowing that I could be fired at any minute for saying that racism exists in the United States, that it exists in Canada, that people are written out of history, and I will not participate in the further writing of people out of history. And so in teaching that history, sometimes I sort of like to say I adopted a pedagogy of vulnerability, where, you make a joke and say, like, I'm gonna get fired for this, but, like, slavery happened. It was bad. I shouldn't have to say that. I shouldn't have to say that racism exists and, like, fear of getting fired and fear that I'll be fired for saying that sort of thing. And, sometimes my students would laugh when, it'd be a joke. Sometimes it'd be really serious. But that moment of that, letting that precarity, letting that vulnerability be visible to my students really caused them to realize that history isn't just history. If it was safely in the past, I wouldn't be in danger of being fired for teaching it in the present. That history is important because we remember it in the present, because it shapes who we are and where we hope to go and who we hope to be. And so I think it was an ethical duty to not shrink away from those histories. And in this political moment where it's getting harder and harder and harder to teach difficult histories of the American past, I think teaching Air India has been a way for me to see how to embrace a futurity based on this vulnerability, to say that it happens everywhere, even in Canada. And if we can't have an American example, having an example of something that happened in Canada and saying, hey, this happens everywhere, it can be a very powerful moment where we can bridge some of the political coalitions that sort of exist across the border, and hopefully against whatever political moment we're sort of dealing with our politicians. So I just want to say that I take a lot of hope from being in a room like this, and I hope I can do justice to the histories that I'm learning about today in this room, and that I continue to read about when I teach my students and bring those thoughts and perspectives into my classroom. And so thank you for letting me be part of this conversation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here today. My parents, Karunamphan and Leela Nair, immigrated to Canada in 1965. It was a time when simply being brown-skinned assured you of standing out in a crowd. But my mother remained faithful to her saris for the next 55 years, because it was who she was. And yet, when Indo-Canadian entered popular vocabulary, she wondered why we could not simply be Canadian. She was not rejecting India. As Althoughthis has beautifully written, India lives on in the souls of its immigrants. But my mother felt strongly that to be Canadian was a recognition of a mutual commitment between an individual and the state, that each would support the well-being of the other. That commitment ought to be, and ought to have been, the epitome of the shared values that are often portrayed as the Canadian identity that transcends all else. For those of us who came of age in 1985, there is no doubt that those aboard Air India Flight 182, along with their families, were denied such a commitment twice over. First, by not being Canadian enough to warrant either attention and protection before the bombing or compassion and justice afterwards. Second, by not being Indian enough. In Canada, the victims are being systematically erased from public consciousness now because none comport with the heroic, glamorous, freedom-fighting, Khalistan-seeking individual that is touted as the Indian in Canada today. Now, what has happened along those dimensions over the last 40 years has been driven by a very small minority. But it is one that does not blush to advocate violence, and one that has proven effective at influencing politicians and the mainstream Canadian media. Now, the exceptions of that latter group are, of course, Kimball and Terry Gladden and Terry Milewski. All three were there at the beginning of this saga and continue to try to bring the truth out of the shadows. So what I wanted to share with all of you today are just a few examples from recent memory of what could be described as a masterful exercise in communication. The art of balancing what one says with what one chooses not to say, along with capitalizing on where people's attention is and where you can be fairly certain that it is not. So I'm going to begin in the closing days of 2020. Just make sure that works. Oh, yes. I wrote this in connection to an announcement from then Prime Minister Trudeau that January 8th would henceforth be known as a day of remembrance for victims of air disasters. The date was chosen in recognition of the first anniversary of the downing of Ukrainian Airlines Flight 752, which had been shot down by the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard. Prime Minister Trudeau also spoke of the lives lost in the crash of Ethiopian Airlines 302 2 years earlier, a result of the Boeing 737 MAX fiasco. But while Prime Minister Trudeau's official announcement included mention of Air India Flight 182, he refrained from saying so when he spoke of commemoration. As I later complained at my blog, it takes a damning combination of indifference and ignorance to announce a day of remembrance for victims of air disasters and choose not to mention the worst air disaster in the nation's history. What I didn't say aloud at that time was that in all likelihood this was a political calculation. We know that video clips often circulate prominently through social media, so what is said or not said is likely designed to appeal to a particular audience, or at the very least not annoy a particular audience. Whereas few Canadians are likely to go and seek out and read the official statement that is published at the government's website, so fuller details will go largely unnoticed. The following June 23rd, that is on the Day of Remembrance for Victims of Terrorism in 2021, the effort that all three political parties made to diminish the scope of what had happened to Canadians was quite something to witness. Again, Prime Minister Trudeau omitted the scope of the Canadian tragedy entirely from his tweet, leaving that for the official statement. And in that statement, victims are described as being from Canada, India, the United States, the United Kingdom, and other countries, all true, but no hint that by far Canadians comprise the majority of the death toll, nor that this was an act of domestic terrorism. Then Leader of the Opposition, Aaron O'Toole, omitted any indication that this date is in reference to a specific act of terrorism, let alone the worst act of terrorism in our nation's history. And Jagmeet Singh contented himself with solely the flight descriptor, Air India 182. Given how few Canadians know about these events, there was reasonable certainty that few would connect this to a massive Canadian death toll. Now, it speaks to the confidence of politicians that their words, or absence thereof, will escape scrutiny by the majority of the Canadian electorate and most of the press. Now, for some years, I've been pushing members of Parliament to have a moment of silence on June 23rd in the House of Commons. And in 2022, that moment happened, largely thanks to the efforts of Member of Parliament Talib Noor Mohammed. He represents Vancouver Centre, and he had worked with the Honourable Bob Rae in the initial government investigation into the bombing and the events before and after. So while MPs did afford that moment of silence in memory of those lost that day, Canadian media also opted for silence. The only record of the moment that I could find is in the Hansard, which means few Canadians will ever know of it. But I should add that Anirudh Bhattacharya provided some nice coverage in the Hindustan Times. Moving on, 2023 was a notable year for too many ugly reasons. In early June, in a parade in Brampton, a tableau celebrating the assassination of Indira Gandhi by her own Sikh bodyguards was titled as Revenge. No Canadian media outlet appeared to cover this issue, or certainly not with pictures, despite that these are well suited to the role of clickbait that drives much of modern journalism, or at least what is passing for journalism. Nor was there any pushback from government bodies. And I'm not asking for a debate on a constitutional right of freedom of expression, although I will say I'm up for it if anybody wants to. Section 1 of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms is quite clear that our rights are limited. But what I would have liked to have seen was our political leaders simply to exercise their own rights of expression and state clearly that they do not agree with, let alone celebrate, the assassination of anyone. Shortly thereafter, Hardeep Singh Nijjar was murdered at a Sikh temple in Surrey, BC. This is the same temple that under his leadership had for decades publicly displayed their support for Talwandar Singh Parmar, the architect of the bombings. Now, following Nijjar's murder, there were open calls for the assassination of Indian diplomats stationed in Canada, and a march had been planned where the destination was the Toronto consulate. So a mob was being summoned. Social media was full of instructions to kill India. In an interview with India Today, Terry Molesky said, "Surely this will, we have to hope, introduce at least a change in the Trudeau government. They can denounce this behavior, they can make it clear, loudly and publicly, that threatening diplomats in this way is not acceptable." The response from Mélanie Joly, who was then the Minister of Foreign Affairs, was neither loud nor clear. Canada takes its obligations under the Vienna Convention regarding the safety of diplomats seriously. Canada remains in close contact with Indian officials in light of some of the promotional materials circulating online regarding a protest planned for July 8th, which are unacceptable. Now, as to how public this was, it seems like Twitter was the extent of it. Even this tepid statement cannot be found on the Global Affairs website. Now, the furor around Nijar's murder was then compounded by some remarks made by Prime Minister Trudeau in the House of Commons in September of that year. And distorted coverage soon followed. Now, this was a very lengthy article from the CBC, which is somewhat out of character for the topic. And it describes Prime Minister Trudeau's address to the House of Commons and quotes his words: "Canadian security agencies have been actively pursuing credible allegations of a potential link between agents of the Government of India and the killing of a Canadian citizen, Hardeep Singh Nijjar." But by the end of that same article, readers are told that National Security Advisor Jodie Thomas informed the UK government that Canada had credible evidence linking India's government to Nijjar's death. I think it is safe to say that the average Canadian reader did not notice the sleight of hand reworking of the words. Now, when I first saw imagery of that billboard, it was actually via a Reuters article. And I was sure that no Canadian publication would run such a picture. And yet here it is. But there is no commentary about it in the text, no mention of a billboard-sized call for assassination. Instead, there's a litany of quotations from various politicians and Canadian officials, all decrying India's conduct and swearing that Canadian justice would be served. This desire to present India in unflattering terms is hardly new. I think it dates back to Confederation, and it's certainly been Canada's pattern throughout the 20th century. But it has become particularly barbed in recent years. In May of 2024, Mr. Sanjay Verma, who at the time was the Indian High Commissioner in Canada, he spoke to the Montreal Council of Foreign Relations. According to the Toronto Star, he lashed out. If one actually watches the CPAC video of this event, you'd come away seeing that Mr. Verma spent the majority of the time discussing the existing trade between India and Canada, and he did so in very positive terms. And just as an aside, our pattern of trade does not change. We ship out raw resources and we buy back value-added finished goods. In any event, Mr. Verma also spoke about the risks or the challenges for international students here in Canada, how vulnerable they are. And he spent less than 5 minutes on the issue of Canadian citizens who agitate against India for Khalistan, and he asked for understanding from Canada that Canadians recognize the question of India's boundaries will be settled by Indians living in India. And it's a sentiment that Canadians clearly share when it comes to our own sovereignty and our own borders against the musings of President Donald Trump. So lashed out is not even remotely accurate in terms of describing the demeanor of the then High Commissioner. June 2024 was also notable for another reason. Bring props. This is 3 pages in the Globe and Mail, which is unheard of. And it is a detailed look into the person who was Hardeep Singh Nijjar. In a media environment that has shown little interest in understanding the nexus that is Canada, Sikhism, Khalistan, India, and Pakistan, and what has happened over the last 40 years, this is probably one of the best pieces of investigative journalism that we have seen from anyone whose surname is not Bolin, Glavin, or Milevsky. And yet one critical error undermines it. Sorry, about to advance that. According to Nancy MacDonald and Greg Mercer, the journalists here, as a consequence of Operation Blue Star in 1984, which was the Indian government's first attempt to remove the terrorist militia elements that had taken over the Golden Temple, according to them, the site of Sikh spiritual power was reduced to rubble. And that is simply not true. In 1984, Mark Tully was a journalist with the BBC stationed in Amritsar, and he saw what was going on. And in this article in 2014, he recalled what had happened. I returned to Amritsar in the first press party taken to the Golden Temple complex. The Golden Temple itself was intact, scarred only by a few bullet holes. Although defenders had fired from the temple, The army had clearly obeyed orders not to fire at it. Now, I have no reason to believe that MacDonald and Mercer deliberately made such an error, but this is one hell of a mistake. Implying that the Golden Temple had been destroyed is a guarantee of sustaining grievances against India. Sifting through news articles and social media can be quite disappointing, but it is relevant if we are trying to educate people as to what has happened. But that said, I'd still like to finish with some nicer words that have been said and documented. I'd like to close with the sentiments of Mark Stagg, who spoke at the inquiry. He had participated in the recovery operation while serving as third officer aboard the Laurentian Forest. But it is the families of Air India Flight 182 that take my breath away, and of whom Canada should be so proud. They have a grace and dignity in the face of such suffering that has been both humbling and a source of renewal and restoration of my belief in humanity. And so the work goes on.